All right, chapter 22 is about neuronal signaling. So we're going to talk about neurons, we're going to talk about action potentials, we're going to talk about neurotransmitters, and the technique for this chapter that's important to understand is the patch clamp technique. Please remember that these videos are designed to help with challenging topics, but they may not cover all of the required details that you find in the objectives. All right, so parts of a neuron. So a neuron is a eukaryotic cell, and its function is to send and receive messages. So a neuron is a special type of cell that can transmit an electrical impulse along its membrane. In general, and you're going to see the last slide of this chapter shows you some differences, but in general we talk about the dendrite, which is the part of the neuron that receives the signal. Okay. Here is the cell body, like a typical eukaryotic cell, with a nucleus and organelles, mitochondria, Golgi, proteins are made, metabolism is happening, and then you get these extensions or processes that come off of the cell body. So dendrites are much shorter than the axon you see here. So dendrites are receiving the signal. The signal we'll talk about kind of diffuses across that cell body, and it reaches a place right here, kind of the connection between the cell body and the axon, and this is called the axon hillock. We'll talk about this more later. This is really important in initiating and help propagating action potential. So there's a whole bunch of sodium voltage gated ion channels at the axon hillock so that we can get an action potential moving. Okay. We go down here through the axon. The cytosol within the axon is called the axoplasm. Okay. The axon is the part that transmits the signal. So it's very long and it's reaching in general to another neuron. You also see something called a myelin sheath, and these are actually cells that are wrapped around the axon, and we'll look at these in more detail in a minute. And the space, which you can't see it as a space, but there is a space between each myelin sheath cell, and that's the node of Ranvier. Okay. This is a break in the myelin sheath, and this is also really important, like the axon hillock, to conducting, propagating, I should say, the action potential. Okay. Axon terminal, you would then have another dendrite here reaching out to the next neuron. Ugly drawings. All right, so let's look at that myelin sheath a little more. The myelin sheath is actually a single cell that's wrapped kind of like a sweet roll around the axon. And so in the central nervous system, the myelin sheath consists of cells called oligodendrites. And in the peripheral nervous system, the myelin sheath consists of cells called Schwann cells. Their function is the same, to help insulate and conduct. So they insulate the axon and they help conduct or propagate the action potentials. And we'll talk in a little bit about what happens when the myelin sheath breaks down. Okay. In between here, you see an exposed axon. That's the node of Ranvier. The node of Ranvier, like I said, is where we get action potentials propagated or reinitiated okay. So this helps with faster, stronger transduction or movement of that signal. And again, we'll talk more about these after we talk about action potentials. One other important part of neuron-neuron communication is what we call a synapse. So the synapse is kind of the connection between two neurons. And this is where communication happens. Okay. So at the end of some of these axons, you get this little bulb called the synaptic bouton. French, I think, or Latin or something. Another language for button. And we'll see that in chemical synapses, this is full of vesicles with neurotransmitters. So the synapse right here is this area between the presynaptic and the postsynaptic neuron. Okay. And you can see that a little more here. What I want you to, the synaptic cleft is the space between. So there's two different types of synapses I'm going to show you right now, and we're going to be talking about chemical synapses, which have this synaptic cleft, this space between them. Oops. There we go. So there are electrical and there are chemical synapses. Electrical, I want you to see that the presynaptic and the postsynaptic cells are physically connected by gap junctions. Okay, so the gap junctions are allowing movement of ions from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic. Okay, and you can kind of see here, it looks like they're kind of sewn together, right? So they're in direct contact, and the ions are flowing through to move the chemical message. So this is a much faster type of getting a message from one neuron to another. Chemical, which is the focus of this chapter, you can see here's the synaptic cleft. It even says right there in little teeny words. Okay, so this is a space. They are not in physical contact, although there are some adherent proteins that help hold, these two neurons close together. What's happening in this cleft is that these little green dots represent neurotransmitters or chemicals that are secreted into this space, and they diffuse to the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. So you can imagine this is slower because you have to allow diffusion to happen.